Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Michael Posey on the show, and today we're talking about everyone's favorite topic, passwords. Now, passwords have been in our digital lives for as long as many of us can remember, and they're going to continue to be in our digital lives for the foreseeable future. But NIST has recently released a number of new guidelines and recommendations when it comes to how passwords are handled, created, the requirements. So in today's episode, Michael and I, we go through that new list of proposed changes by NIST, what they mean for you, and we also just have some general discussion on the state of passwords in our industry. And all in all, it's a great episode. So you got that and lots more in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got Michael Posey with me today. How's it going, Michael?
Good, Andy. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, definitely. I've lost track. I try to keep track of how many times each guest has been on, but I want to say this is for you now, maybe
I think
5?
so. I think that's right.
Sounds good. Well, it's always good having you here. We have great discussions, and we've got an interesting topic today. At least I think it's interesting because we have some updated guidelines from NIST, but some people may think passwords is what we're talking about today. Some people may think passwords are not interesting, but they are, of course, a core part of our security strategy, have been and will be. So I saw the new guidelines from NIST, and I felt like it was important that we do an episode on this just to kind of raise some awareness around them. And I'm sure I'll reference Family Guy at some point throughout the episode, but there's just some things with NIST requirements and public awareness that have, and I'm quoting Peter Griffin here, just grinds my gears over the last couple of years. So anyway, we'll get into that. So,
and the good thing is you'll do another one of these in 6 months or whenever they update their recommendations again. So it's a gift that keeps on giving in terms of content.
I know, right? So there is that, which is a good thing. So anyway, before we get too far into our episode here, Michael, just in case some of our listeners may not know who you are, can you give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do for Hornet Security?
Yeah, so my name's Mike Posey. I'm a sales engineer for Hornet Security in North America, and I tend to take care of some of our larger key partners to make sure that, whatever their requirements are, we identify what those are and we get their sort of the white glove service, if you will, just to make sure that all their needs and functions are taken care of. And whether that's from developing some scripts to help them with their day-to-day or identifying product feature requests or whatever that might be, or just a shoulder to cry on or talk to. But the goal here is to take care of our clients. But for me, this is something I've been doing for 18 plus years. I've been working with the channel, working with partners around email security, right? So email protection, encryption, archiving, et cetera, backup, everything. So from, the general idea of technology, this is sort of falls in line because this is something that we always talk about. And unfortunately, it's like you said, it's not an exciting thing. But these password policies have evolved over the years and they will continue to evolve. And it's not the last time you'll see a requirement or, some sort of a recommendation in terms of your stance in terms of passwords and security. So,
sure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And you bring up a good point. I mean, it's not the last time we're going to see these change. And I see the question come up like, well, why do I have to worry about NIST or why do I have to worry about CIS, right? And I see it come up in the cybersecurity community quite frequently that like, yeah, maybe some of the controls in these frameworks are not, like some sexy new technology, right? But I mean, these frameworks are out there for a reason. They're designed to help keep organizations safe just by virtue of following the controls, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's why it's important to kind of highlight these. And so today we're talking about passwords, as we've mentioned. And I want to just kind of start by talking about just authentication mechanisms in general, right? And passwords have been around for ever and ever and ever, right? In varying degrees of strength, different ciphers used to hash them and et cetera, et cetera. And they continue to be at least I would argue, they're still our primary means of authentication, even though we have some new technologies out there like passkeys. I had Jan Bacher on a couple months ago, and we did 2 episodes on passkeys in the Microsoft space. I'll put the link to those episodes in the show notes, folks. And I think passkeys has a real potential to maybe not supplant passwords anytime soon, but definitely become a viable alternative just because of the public key cryptography nature of that solution. But I think passwords are here for the long haul yet. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Michael.
No. I think passwords are obviously they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to continue to be used everywhere, whether it's a passkey or some other new invention.
Right.
So with that regard, and it's fun too, because sometimes passwords are used in things you wouldn't expect. Like there's a couple places that I've been to where when you make a reservation, they give you a password. In order to actually get into the business, you have to supply this password that was given to you at the time of reservation.
Right.
From a speakeasy to an Italian restaurant in Vegas, it's kind of fun. You walk into a little room, you knock on the door, they open the little slat, they ask for your password, and if it doesn't match, you can't get in. It's fun little things like that, but passwords are extremely important, especially around tech. Getting your food's important too, but making sure your sensitive data is protected and secure is super important.
For sure. And another area where I see passwords being around long term, when we talk about passkeys specifically, is I see this big concern, I guess I'll call it, amongst people starting to adopt passkeys. Is like, well, hey, I'm losing my second factor by going to passkeys, right? By not using some sort of MFA token or right. Well, a lot of people don't realize that in order to utilize a passkey, you have to unlock it. Right now, if you're using passkeys on like a mobile device, you're going to use biometrics to unlock it. Or if you're using like a password manager on your PC or your Mac, you have to typically use a password to unlock the password manager. Therefore, the password becomes the second factor in that case, right? And so I can see them sticking around long term for that too, if nothing else. So anyway, let's get to the new recommendations from NIST, and there were a couple of them. And I think the very first one that's been updated on their list, and there's some very particular verbiage that they use in certain parts of the document. Keywords here being, shall and should. You see those differences in the document, and I'm going to link the official NIST document that I'm talking about here. I actually have it open here. It is publication 863B, as in Bravo. Yeah. So
I think next time they'll replace those with kindly as well. So
yeah. So, but yeah, I'll link that in the show notes so you guys have it. So anyway, the first item we have on our list here, and I totally agree with it, is credential service providers, or CSPs, not to be confused with cloud service providers. Credential service providers shall require passwords be a minimum of 8 characters in length, and should require that passwords be 15 characters in length. And so I mean, I'm of the standpoint here that 8 characters is in no way, shape, or form long enough, right? But I start thinking about, end users like my parents. They're retired. They have to remember a billion passwords already. I try to get them to use password managers, but they're not connected to the net all the time. So something like Bitwarden isn't necessarily always an option, right? So I get the reason why, the requirement is 8 characters, but the recommendation, of course, is 15 plus. And we're going to get into the whole conversation around password length here in a little bit, but I think this is a nice change, right? So they're starting to push that length conversation a little bit more.
Do you think the requirement for 8 is set because password is actually 8 letters?
That's an interesting observation.
I'm just kidding.
Be it. That must totally be it, right?
That's to save everyone who uses password for their password, right? PA55WORD or whatever.
Well, hopefully most credential service providers are not allowing, commonly used passwords like password, right?
Yeah.
But how about those people that, replace the A with an @ symbol? That works, right?
Oh, that's tricky. I would have never guessed that.
Right. And that's we're going to come back to that here in a second, but I wanted to make that joke as well. Anyway, the next item on the list here is CSPs, again, credential service providers, should allow password maximums of at least 64 characters. So, a personal story, I don't remember which financial institution it was, so I can't name and shame. But I remember it wasn't that long ago. I was logging into some service that had to do with finances, and been a while since I logged into it. Forgot my password, so I'm going through the reset process, right? And there was a password maximum of like 16 characters or something like that, and I'm like, really? Why would you cap me at 16 characters? Now, there's probably some legacy database on the back end that has a restriction or something, but like in this day and age, I mean, it's 2024 as of the time of this recording. Like there should be no arbitrary restrictions like that, right? At least in my opinion.
I've encountered the exact same thing, and I don't know if it's like an old base 4, base 64, or some sort of encryption algorithm that says, hey, we can only take so many characters because when we hash it and rehash it and whatever, it gets too large. But I've encountered that same exact thing, and I just think it was like you said, an oversight or legacy data that they just haven't updated or refreshed.
Right.
Which gives me a lot of security in terms of feeling secure because.
Or on the to kind of go along the same lines, you hear about those services where they don't impose a limit, but on the back end they truncate whatever password you supply down to whatever their character limit is internally, and then hash that, right? Which begs a whole other different concern, right? But
my personal favorite is to use a special character, but we only accept 5 special characters.
Which leads us to the next point in NIST's new recommendations, right? Credential service providers shall not impose composition rules, which means requiring that special character mixture. Like, oh, hey, you need to create a new password. It needs to require 1 special character, 1 number, 1 uppercase letter, and your left kidney. I mean, so those aren't requirements anymore either. And I think there's a big reason for that, right? And I think it comes down to, I think it's kind of related to password rotations, which we'll talk about here in a little bit as well, in that those types of restrictions cause people to serialize their passwords or create passwords in very predictable patterns, like putting an exclamation point at the end of whatever their password is, right? Or replacing A's with an @ symbol, like I mentioned earlier, right? So it creates predictability. Predictability is the bane of secure passwords, one of them anyway. And so I think that's partially why this rule has been, has been recommended. And you can see that they've started focusing more so on the length of the password, right? And I think a lot of that is because you look at the GPUs that we have at our disposal today. Length is way more difficult to brute force than character composition, right? And we'll get into that a little bit. So, and interestingly, to kind of go along with this, it's kind of not a requirement that they have composition rules, but they are now saying that CSPs, credential service providers, should allow the use of ASCII and Unicode characters. So they're not requiring composition rules, but let's give people more character sets to work with in terms of passwords, right?
Yeah, my question on that one when I saw that was, are they limiting, the types of Unicode characters? Like, are you going to be able to use Synology or the miscellaneous ones, like the little ninja star or the upside down question mark? Because obviously on a Windows keyboard, you have to hit Alt and you have to do the 4-character combination.
Right.
But like on laptops, you don't necessarily have that keypad, so you have to do a lot of extra things or find the character map or whatever, which it does create a lot of complexity. But I like the idea because now you can have, the guy that's, flipping a table as your password. And move forward.
That's
Sorry.
no, it makes sense though. It's true, and I think it's a good change. Obviously,
Yeah.
more options is better. But yeah, to your point, it is going to add complexity for credential service providers, in that they are now going to have to create mechanisms with these types of user interface concerns in mind, right? What if the user doesn't have a full keyboard available to them? What if they just have a touchscreen? So those are all questions that I think the industry is going to have to figure out. So
Yeah, for sure.
The next, just kind of minor mentions here. And again, I'm going to put the full document in the show notes. But two other things I wanted to mention that have kind of changed in terms of recommendations. Stop requiring specific types of characters. Again, that kind of ties into the composition rules we talked about. And I mentioned one that really grinds my gears, again, channeling my inner Peter Griffin there. And the reason why. So the new recommendation, and it's not just a recommendation, NIST actually refers to this as a requirement now. Stop mandating periodic password changes unless there's evidence of breach. Now, that has been a recommendation, not a requirement, but a recommendation from NIST for, I want to say, about 2 years now. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where people are either complaining about regular password rotations, or admins are asking what type of rotation period they should put in place. And I'm like, NIST recommends you don't do that anymore. And they're like, really? And so like the community hasn't gotten that message. I think now that NIST is saying, hey, this is a requirement of credential service providers, I think it's a good thing. And the question is why. If you're not familiar why this is a bad thing for password security, I mentioned it earlier, it causes users to create serialized passwords, right? So spring 2024, summer 2024, fall 2024. And so again, it brings back that predictability factor in the password, and doesn't really make us more secure. Maybe it makes us feel more secure, but it doesn't really add a whole lot of security there. So that's my soapbox moment for the episode.
No, you're absolutely right though, because I helped out in an investigation of a phishing attack that was posted and happened in 365 and SharePoint, and the passwords that were being entered into the fake login page were stored in a WordPress site, and they didn't encrypt the document. They didn't encrypt it was available to anyone. And you could see the passwords getting created as people fell for it. And what was funny was you would see the passwords that were getting created, and you would say, like you said, spring 2024. Then it was spring 2024 exclamation point, spring 2024 exclamation point, exclamation point. You could see this user trying passwords over and over and over again. And then you could really understand what the idea or the mentality of the user is. It's like, hey, I just want an easy password. I don't want to have to figure out what my password's supposed to be. And I just want some sort of combination that I can continue to use, which is alarming for most people, but it's the truth. It's people don't want to have complexity injected into their lives if they can avoid it.
Right.
If we didn't have to have a deadbolt and a security system and everything else on our homes, we would love to have a front door that never locked, if we could trust people and never had anything bad happen. But unfortunately, that's not where we live. We have to have a lock. We have to have a deadbolt. We have to have security system. It goes on and on and on. And that induces complexity to just entering your house. So these are things that we always have to take, with a grain of salt, and understand complexity is going to come. We just have to adapt and accept it.
Yep. Very true. And that kind of ties into the next point I want to talk about, and what the industry has historically deemed to be quote unquote complex passwords are not necessarily good passwords, especially if the length is short. So, for example, I'm gonna stick with this example, even though it's kind of a joke example. Password with an @ symbol for the A, and maybe a 1 on the end, and an exclamation point. The industry has kind of taken that method, right? Injecting special characters, adding some numbers, and back then was an unexpected way, has become the norm. And you can't really say those are complex passwords anymore, quote unquote, right? And so we've found that with the computing power that is available to us today via even just a single 4080 NVIDIA GPU, right? I mean, the quickness with which you can brute force a password is kind of staggering. And I'm gonna get to some of the stats here in just a little bit, but I want to talk about how length is better and randomosity is better in terms of passwords, right? And um, a lot of what I've learned over the years in terms of password security comes from Steve Gibson over on the Security Now podcast, one of my personal favorite podcasts. And Steve's been in the industry for, I don't know, 40 years plus, I think. He's been around forever. But he talks a lot about the concept of password entropy. And if you're not familiar with what entropy is in terms of security and passwords, basically it's just talking about the randomosity of a given string, right? A string of text. And the more random, the better, because we know that there are password attacks out in the wild that utilize things like rainbow tables and word lists, right? A word list is exactly what it sounds like. It's a list of words that the password cracker is going to try in succession, right? Or in parallel, depending on the tool. A rainbow table, if you're not familiar with it, is simply a table of pre-computed hashes. So the password cracking utility will try those given hashes, and each hash, like I said, is already pre-computed and associated with, very common passwords, right? And so, simple passwords are easily cracked because of those types of cracking attacks. Now, that's where the randomosity comes into play. If I have a truly random password, let's say, 20 characters of truly random text, I'm way more secure than if I used the entire alphabet A to Z, right? Even though it's really long, it's predictable, which is a bad thing. And that's where we get into the length discussion. But before I get into the length discussion, I'm going to stop talking for a second here, Michael, and let you get a word in. If you have
No,
any thoughts.
I think no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're going to have certain characteristics that you're going to see based on the language that you're using, right? So if we use English as the most common language for passwords or whatever, it's probably not. But there's certain character combinations that exist more frequently than others. And regardless of what word you are, I before E, except that, all these other sort of rules, we can use those hashes to fill in certain pieces and elements.
Yep.
And having a preconceived idea or way letters line up doesn't help that ability to crack passwords. And that randomosity is definitely something that plays into that favor, right? I know a lot of friends in the industry, they obviously like phrases or
Yep.
movie quotes or something like that, where they'll use the first letter of each letter in the quote, but they'll change or alternate with capitals and lowercases and numbers or other things, right? And then they'll alternate the quotes whenever they need to. But they end up having a very long password that's easy for them to remember and is pretty random at that case. So.
Yep. And the other thing I've seen to kind of build on that, when we're talking about administrators and security professionals, if you have a service or an admin account or something that guards the crown jewels, right? Obviously, you want something that is truly random and is of sufficient entropy to avoid today's brute force attacks and the brute force attacks of the future. That's when I would not try to come up with my own random password. That's when I would leverage like a password manager of some sort to generate a truly random string for me, right? And obviously it's not going to be something that you're going to remember, but you're going to document the hell out of that password inside your password manager or somewhere that's secure, right? Or in the account of, like 365 break glass accounts. I see a lot of organizations that, they'll come up with a very random string and use that as the password. And they won't even store it digitally. They'll put it on a piece of paper and it gets locked in a safe somewhere in the business, right?
Or put under the keyboard. I'm kidding.
It's been
Taped
a
to the
while
monitor.
since I've seen that. Granted, I've been a full remote worker for the last almost 10 years now, so I haven't had the opportunity to see that recently, but I really hope people still aren't doing that, but I know they are.
Something that popped into my head too, and not to derail this conversation, I think, and I don't see it anywhere on the NIST side. And it made me realize that I don't necessarily recall seeing this anywhere, and I could just be slipping me, but I think the NIST standards are also for users, right? So when you start talking about mission critical systems where you have these super long passwords that are randomly generated, I think some of these NIST recommendations don't necessarily always apply in terms of best practices for some of those things. And I know this might be, treading on thin ice, but if you have a mission critical system and you're randomly generating a password, there's nothing wrong with generating a new password every 30, 60, 90 days, whatever that process is, to keep it safe. The NIST standards typically try to leverage what's acceptable for a user to not necessarily prevent them from gaining access to a system, but also keeping them safe.
True.
So there's definitely times and use cases for these standards and recommendations, but there's obviously use cases for when you have a system that is this is mission critical, that millions of people are going to die or whatever if something happens, or systems are going to crash or services are going to die.
Right.
You probably want to put some more rigorous standards in place than even what NIST is recommending. And it's, 6 or 1/2 dozen, but I think, it's within reason. I think something like that would be perfectly fine. So
that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because this has come up a lot in conversations I've had recently, in that it comes down to analyzing your risk, right? And we'll stick with your example, right? Of, I've got the system that if it goes offline, people die. I have Eric Syrewicze on the show quite frequently. He works in IT healthcare, healthcare IT. So they are literally in that situation with some of their stuff, and that, the systems that they're supporting are literally supporting someone's life, right? And so in that type of situation, if you, as the security professional in your organization, you have analyzed that risk, that you have this password that needs to be on a rotation, it's outside the norm of those NIST recommendations, but you're aware of it, you're managing it, and you're following best security practices as part of that. That is absolutely okay, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I think the NIST is just to make sure that people have some idea of secure.
Yep.
When it comes to passwords, right? It's not necessarily the end all is all, or the playbook or the rule book. It's just something that gives someone a good standard to follow.
For sure.
And there are organizations that say you have to follow the NIST standard at a minimum. So you can go above and beyond, but these are sort of like the minimum benchmarks that they think should be followed.
Yep, for sure. And I didn't put it on the outline, but I actually intended to put it on the outline. Another thing that they called out in this iteration is the recommendation that we stop using knowledge-based authentication. And so one example of that would be security questions for resetting your password, right? Security questions like, hey, where were you born?
Or what was your pet's first name?
If pet's first name. Exactly, that type of thing.
Our first pet's name, yeah.
When I saw that, I kind of perked up, because I'm going to mention Eric again. Eric Syrewicze and I, it was either on the last episode he was on or the time before, one of our recent episodes, he and I were talking about that in regards to the national public data breach that happened recently. So National Public Data is a data broker that amassed vast quantities of data, and that data was leaked. Now, a ton of our personal data is already out there, right? So it wasn't a huge revelation. It was a bad breach, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like a huge revelation of some new data. But what was interesting about that breach is security researchers found that they could make cross links between individuals using that data set. So now, bringing that back to our conversation around knowledge-based authentication with security questions, stuff like mother's maiden name, cousin's name. So that type of information, those linkages can be made with data that's publicly available now. Therefore, those security questions and things of that nature, not so great anymore. Not to mention the people that, hey, this was my first truck that I ever had on Facebook, right? So
yeah. And the data collection tools are fun, right? Let's take this test on Facebook and other social media platforms to see what, we think, and let's collect some data and let's take a picture, and
yep.
It's all going somewhere, and we're supplying their content very quickly.
For sure. For sure. Well, what I wanted to wrap up with, Michael, is just talking about password length. So, that was the very first thing that we talked about today in NIST's list of new recommendations is password length. And everybody's heard this, right? In terms of, the longer the password, the better. Well, that's still the case. And again, bringing the conversation back to that entropy discussion, the longer the password, the better. Now, I have a nifty chart from Bitwarden. I'm not sponsoring Bitwarden in any way, shape, or form, but they have a nice chart that I like to reference for this in terms of password length and the amount of time to crack it. Well, in the 5 to 7 character range, time to crack is seconds to minutes using modern computing standards. Character length of 8 to 10 characters, time to crack is hours to days, which really is not that long. 11 to 13 characters is months to years. And, they list 14 to 16 plus as centuries to crack. Now, again, I'm going to reference Steve Gibson one more time. He gives some really good advice that I tend to agree with, is that when we look at password security through the lens of recent breaches like the LastPass breach, right? You've got some passwords that are now potentially in the wild because of the outcome of that particular breach. You want to craft passwords of a sufficient length that not only protects you from the brute force attacks of today, but the ones of tomorrow and the year after and 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So even though this chart only goes up to 16 plus characters, the recommendation that I've been giving is 20 plus characters should give you sufficient entropy for not only today's brute force attacks, but for the foreseeable future as well. So that's the recommendation I've been going with.
And I think the idea too is that as we understand how passwords and the ability and power of CPUs and tools at our disposal have increased over time, passwords need to be more complex. And there was when you were talking about the video cards and the speed to which it can crack them, I found I had to look up something real quick, but there's an application out there that a lot of cyber professionals use called Hashcat. And with a 4090, and assuming it's an 8-character password with at least one number and one special character, it can actually utilize commonly used passwords, but it takes a normal 48-minute cracking brute force cycle where it tests 200 billion possible combinations. It takes it down to milliseconds for the password breaking capability, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So the tools are out there. The hardware is getting more readily available. And you have people who have been crypto mining for a long time with lots of GPUs at their disposal. I have, I think 8 in the closet right now. Not current versions or anything, but it's just things haven't thrown away. But there's lots of resources out there for people to utilize, and it's just going to get quicker and quicker. So passwords will continue to evolve, standards will continue to get updated, and there's going to be more and more requirements for further complexities.
Yep.
So passkeys are something that makes sense in a lot of cases.
For sure. And it's probably it's a discussion for a different episode, but I do know that there are folks in the industry that are working on new hashing methods that are more difficult for GPUs to crack specifically to kind of avoid that brute forcing issue, right? At least as far as GPUs are concerned.
Is that Intel's play to get back into the CPU market?
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
Oh, maybe. Who knows? So, well, I think that's about all the time we have for this episode, Michael. We'll have to shut it down after that one. I
know. I'm kidding. I read an article the other day talking about the changes of CPU, the specialization of the CPU and how some companies aren't leveraging that because it's not where their main business has been. Right. So that was something that was relative, but it's a different type of CPU and processing power. So it's interesting for sure.
That gives me an idea for another episode. Might be interesting to. I've got a couple of hardware guys that I know in the industry. Might be interesting to have one of them come on and do an episode about, like on chip security. The stuff that's baked directly into the CPU. That might be interesting to do at some point. But anyway, just thinking out
Yeah, a
loud.
couple of years ago, there was a cellular company that was making all the news about all the data that was getting offloaded back to a foreign country. So,
Yeah.
good
Yep.
topics.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, Michael, thanks for coming on the show and spending some time
Yep.
with us. Good to have you as always, my friend.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yep. And those of you watching, hopefully you found some value in today's episode. If you enjoyed watching the episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button. I've told myself that I'm not going to say smash the like and subscribe button, but I say it every episode now. So it's just kind of ingrained in my sign off for the show. So anyway, you can also find us on all of all the major podcasting platforms as well. And with that, we'll let you get back to the rest of your day. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.